Welcome to the Apologetics Guy Show. It's the podcast that helps you find clear answers to tough questions about God, Jesus, and the Bible, and then helps you to better explain your faith with both courage and compassion. If we're just meeting, I'm Dr. Mikel Del Rosario. I'm the host of this podcast, and I'm also a professor of Bible and theology at the Moody Bible Institute right here in downtown Chicago. And I want to welcome you to my independent show. Well, today we have a special topic, which is one that I'm often asked about. And that's the question of how we got the Bible, and specifically how we got the New Testament. And so maybe you've heard questions about why do we have the books that we do? Maybe somebody's asked you what are the best translations or what is the best translation for me to use. And so we're going to talk about how to answer those questions today. And my guest on the show is Peter Gurry. Peter is Associate Professor of New Testament at Phoenix Seminary, and he is the co-director of the Text and Canon Institute as well. Welcome to the show, Peter.
Great to be with you, Miguel.
So you did your PhD at University of Cambridge, but we also have this interesting DTS Moody connection because you did the THM Master of Theology at Dallas Theological Seminary like I did and got to study under Dan Wallace. You got to work with Dan Wallace quite a lot. But we also have this Moody connection because you're a Moody grad, right?
That's right. I spent 4 years there as an undergraduate student, and I even have a deeper connection there because my sister went there and so did my mom. So it's a bit of a family line there.
Oh, wow. That's amazing. Now, did you ever, do you remember taking a class called Bible Introduction?
I did, yes. Oh, yes.
Well, you'll be pleased to know that this book that you co-wrote with John Mead, Scribes in Scripture, I love the subtitle, The Amazing Story of How We Got the Bible. Fun fact, Peter, this book is now a required text in Bible Intro at the Moody Bible Institute in my class.
Is it really?
Yeah.
That's fantastic. I mean, I have vivid memories of that class and remember the textbook we used, and I don't want to oversell it, but I think it's fair to say that class had a formative influence on my decision to do what I do. So I always tell people I discovered a fascination for the history of the Bible in high school, but then it was really, lit on fire when I was in Bible college, and I was fascinated because I didn't know anything about the history of the Bible as a kid, really, and then even going into college, I didn't know that much, really. So when I found out, I was pretty hooked. That's great.
Well, that's awesome to hear. Well, you'll be pleased to hear we're using your book in Bible Intro now, and a lot of students really appreciate it, and they find it very approachable and helps them really understand the issues. We study textual criticism in the class. We talk about canonization, of course, and all of these different issues with translation. But students get inspired, like you were, to study Greek or study Hebrew. Maybe God's calling them to be a translator and look at different ministries that are translating the Bible even today, because the story goes on today, right? It's not like the story is done. Right. Translation goes on, and we can actually be a part of it. So, well, tell us a little bit about why you've dedicated so much of your ministry over the years to helping people answer questions about how we got the Bible.
To me, it's a fascinating story. It's a reminder to us that the Bible hasn't always looked the way it does now. Hasn't always had chapters and verse numbers like it does now. The English language has changed, and so our translations have had to change with it. Many people who were able to read it in handwritten copies until the invention of the printing press. And so I think for me, it does a couple things. One, it just helps me appreciate the Bible as I have it now, where it is, I think, fair to say, very accessible. Now, I know there's things that are hard to understand and things that can be confusing, especially for new readers. But the fact that you can pick up a Bible and pretty much know how it works intuitively is the result of a lot of people doing a lot of work over the centuries. So that part I love. That the way we have the Bible now is thanks to a lot of hardworking and ingenious people over the centuries. I think another reason is it inspires me to love the Bible because once you start to understand how many people have had a hand in shaping it, and some of those people have given their lives, literally, some of them have just given of their talents or their energy or their money, it just inspires me not to take it for granted. And I do think that in an age where Bibles are so easy to come by for us English speakers, you can download a Bible app and have hundreds of them potentially on your phone for free. It's easy actually to take it for granted and
Yeah.
think, well, it's just this thing that there's so much of it, so whatever, ignore it. And I just think, well, a lot of people in the history of Christianity have not had easy access to the
Hmm.
Bible, if they've had it at all. And so part of why I love doing it is because it gives me the chance to remind people not to take the Bible for granted.
Yeah. Yeah, that's great. So there's a personal fascination that comes just by studying it, also helping people develop more of an appreciation for themselves about the Bible that they have, that they maybe take to church with them every week. This wasn't a very convenient thing that we had. God really
Yeah.
worked through a lot of people to give us the Bible that we have today. But there are a couple of really big questions that I get when it comes to the history of the Bible. And these are questions like, why do we have the 27 books that we have? Questions about the canon, and then what's the best translation for me to read? And this is a question now about mostly talking about English translation. So I want to talk about those key areas today, and we'll just start with canon, and let's start with that discussion about these 27 books of the New Testament. How do we help somebody understand why we have these books instead of perhaps other books?
Yeah, it's a great question. People often wonder this, and sometimes people don't think about it until they're forced to think about it. And then once they are, then they really want to know, because they realize,
Yeah.
well, I've never actually thought about it. How could the Bible look any different than it does now?
Hmm.
But of course, it hasn't always looked the same. The first thing I think to say, Michaela, on this is actually what did not happen. It's very common for people to think that the books of the Bible were decided by a church council, or maybe one individual church leader,
Hmm.
or somebody like Constantine. He's a common subject who's offered as having decided the Bible. So the most common form is people will point to the Council of Nicaea in AD 325, and that's just a very common myth, but it is actually a myth. There's no evidence at all that the Council of Nicaea had anything to do with the books of the Bible. The council was primarily about other doctrinal issues like the doctrine of the Trinity and the doctrine of Christ with it, but they didn't really say anything about the canon as far as we know.
Hmm.
And I think it's worth asking ourselves the question, why does that myth persist, actually? Before we give sort of what I think is the more historically accurate answer, it's worth at least pausing and saying, well, why does a myth persist? And I think there's two reasons. One is, for some people, the myth feeds into a larger narrative that Christianity is the product of a conspiracy, or power-hungry bishops
Hmm.
imposing their will on lay people who maybe had different views of Christianity, or better views of Christianity even. And so it fits that larger narrative that our culture today is prone to, I suppose, that
Hmm.
powerful people only have power because they've manipulated other people and they've abused their power. And I don't think that's the case and when it comes to the canon. The other reason, though, I think the myth persists is because actually it does provide a simple answer. And it's nice to have a simple answer. And in fact, if it were the answer, it would be really nice, because I could answer people like you all the time with that simple answer. Say, well, they decided the Council of Nicaea in 325, and that was it, right? And
There
it's
you go.
not the case. And the real answer is quite a bit more messy. It's not that
Hmm.
simple. There's no single person or council that you can point to and say they decided. You really can't. So what I would argue is that the biblical canon, we're thinking, I guess, really of the New Testament canon here, but is the product of early Christians doing two things. One, asking themselves what differentiates different books that they were reading from each other. Okay. And then also reflecting on what these books themselves said and taught. So I would say those are maybe two ways to think about it. In the first
Hmm.
case, and I think the first one is maybe the big one, if I were to point to a single reason why we have some books and not others in our New Testament, it is that the books that we have in the New Testament are the books the early church believed were written by the apostles or their close associates.
Hmm.
And the books that we do not have, they are not in the Bible because the early church was convinced that they were not written by apostles or their close associates. So if you want to find one sort of single answer for the New Testament, I think that's it. Now, those things had to get debated and talked about, because not everybody agreed and people weren't sure about some things. Some books in the New Testament are really small, like 2nd and 3rd John, so they probably did not circulate very widely and maybe were not known very well early on. But I do think that's maybe the one criterion to rule them all, if I can put it that way, is it was a question of were they written by an apostle or a close associate.
Okay, so you've touched on a number of things there, but one thing just to make clear is the difference between something that was decided as if arbitrarily by one person and something that was discovered
Or
as recognized
Yeah.
as the church began to see, well, which books of the apostles are being used in churches, which books written by the apostles' associates are being used in churches. And there's a sense that this kind of canon consciousness was there in the church, and that it had been coming together almost on its own organically, if I could say it that way, versus Constantine or some bishop just decided it, based on their own fiat. But I think there is kind of a comfort and a peace that comes from that it wasn't just one guy who decided, well, here's the list and that's that,
Right.
This was a thing the whole church got together to affirm. Yes.
Right.
Anybody using the Gospel of Mark in your church? Yeah, pretty much. All of us say yes. Anybody using Gospel of Thomas? Not so much, So
you have very, very few, especially when it comes to the Gospels, very few examples of records of Christians reading non-canonical Gospels. I think we have like one, maybe two.
That's right.
With like the Gospel of Peter, where there's a church that was reading it and somebody writes and says, hey, kind of stop doing that.
Yeah.
So, you have to remember these non-canonical Gospels were written by people and they were read, of course. So we shouldn't act like they were like nobody knew about them or something like that. But when it came to what books are Christians going to read to decide doctrine and to, as you said, read in church, well, you have the four gospel canon from very early on, I think. So anyways, I'm getting ahead of ourselves though.
Let's talk about the earliest lists, because sometimes people want to find a definitive list. Okay, well, like when's the earliest list where we have the core of the New Testament documents? How far back can we go, and what books are on there? Or perhaps it might be easier to ask what books aren't on there.
Yeah, sure. So first of all, just a word about what these lists are. Various writers would give lists of what books they thought were authoritative for Christians. And so these are some of our most explicit evidence for this question. There are other types of evidence, like you can look at quotations, you could look at manuscripts and see what books are included in manuscripts. But canon lists are probably the most explicit, where the author is explicitly saying, here's a list of authoritative books, right? And so for that, they're really helpful. So we have up to around AD 400, we have about 18 of these lists, either in like Greek or Latin. I think one of them might be in Syriac. Okay. The earliest one we have is from Origen, and it, depending on a couple factors, it could be our earliest list, and also our earliest list to have all 27 books. Okay, and it's written in about 250 AD, so that's really early. There's a couple tricks with it though. One is we actually do not have Origen's Greek original of it. He wrote in Greek, and we don't have that. What we have is a Latin translation from a later author named Rufinus, who translates Origen's works. And there's there's a couple different copies of it as well. So, for example, some copies have Revelation in the list and some don't. Okay, and depending on that depends whether does he have all 27 books or just 26. Okay, then there's a couple things like the epistles of John. He doesn't specify, he doesn't name all three of them. He doesn't say 1st, 2nd, and 3rd John like we do. Okay, so there's some areas where it could be clear. We might like it to be clearer, but if Revelation is there, if something like the epistles of John refers to all three, then that list would be our earliest 27 list. After that, you kind of have to wait till the 4th century before you get a clear list of the same 27 books that we have. In something like, probably the most famous one is Athanasius in the year 367. So a little more than midway through the 4th century there, right? But again, you have all. What's interesting about these lists is that for the most part, all of them agree on what we might call an essential core canon. So basically, what they're debating or what's in question is some of these smaller books, like 2nd and 3rd John, or 2nd Peter or Jude, and then Revelation is also another one that's sort of in or out depending on the list. But all 4 Gospels are there. It's not like we have a list that has 5 gospels or a list that has
Right.
2. Okay,
Hmm.
which is pretty remarkable when you think about it.
Yeah.
It's not just all 4, but it's exactly these 4, right?
Hmm.
So, and then the letters of Paul become pretty standardized pretty early on. 14 letters, including Hebrews. Usually they included Hebrews with the Pauline letters, and Acts as well. First Peter and First John are pretty widely attested as well. So you have these, like I said, you have these like 18 or so lists in up to the 4th century, or up to the year 400, excuse me.
Hmm.
And there's really a surprising amount of overlap. And again, if it was, you'd expect different things. If either this was some decision by fiat from one individual, right? If it was Constantine
Hmm.
or somebody earlier, you'd expect more uniformity, actually.
Hmm.
At the same time, if it was some kind of conspiracy, or if there was no agreement at all, maybe I should go that way. If there's no agreement at all, okay, you'd expect these lists to be sort of all over the place,
Yeah.
right? Maybe the best example I can give as a counterexample is somebody like Marcion, who's in the 2nd century, who
Hmm.
does have according to Tertullian, his main critic, does have a different list. He doesn't accept all 4 Gospels. He only accepts Luke's, and he doesn't
Hmm.
accept all of Paul's letters either.
And with his
Right?
own personal edits to Luke too, right?
Correct. Right. So Tertullian also accused him of editing the Gospels. So he would be sort of the key counterexample to this larger narrative, where
Hmm.
there's this developing core canon. Marcion would be this alternate view where you have somebody going the other direction. But like I said, he's more of an outlier than typical, if I can put it that way.
Hmm. Yeah, so we have this organic process where it wasn't just one guy who decided everything. And I think it's also a comfort to know that people weren't just willy-nilly adding things to the canon. They were being very careful. Why is Second Peter so discussed? Well, there
Hmm.
were forged works with Peter's name on it.
Right.
And so the church was being very careful to say, well, hang on, let's just not be so hasty to throw a book into the canon.
Right.
And these things had to be vetted and checked out.
I think there's 2 good test cases for thinking through exactly that issue. One is, like you mentioned, books that in their, at least in their title, have claim to be written by an apostle. So something like
Hmm.
the Gospel of Peter or the Apocalypse of Peter, something like this. And the church does reject them and says, no, we have no sort of reason to believe these are actually written by the apostle whose name they have. Okay, Gospel of Thomas would be another example.
Hmm.
But then on the other side, you have books that they really like the Shepherd of Hermas,
Hmm.
that many early Christians comment on and quite like, seems to me. But they will say things like, well, but this book we know is written in our own time, and their own time is now the 2nd or 3rd century. And
Yeah.
so they're saying, even though we like it, we know it can't be written by an apostle, right? So again, it's not, the criterion can't be, is it a book we just like?
Yeah.
or is it a book that criticizes people we don't like?
Hmm.
But
Hmm.
that's not it, because something like the Shepherd of Hermas is quite popular, in fact. But they're convinced, the early Christian writers are convinced that it's too late to be by an apostle, and so it's out, even though they like it quite a bit.
Hmm. Hmm. Yeah. Talk about the different ways you kind of mentioned this a little bit earlier in terms of was it written by an apostle or a close associate? Talk about
Yeah.
the different criteria, the ways that we've seen throughout church history, the criteria that were applied to these the books that were under consideration for inclusion in the canon.
Yeah, so people sometimes talk about these criteria, and I think we probably need to be careful. It's not as if these early Christian writers all set down their criteria and share them with each other, and they all use the same thing. But you do see some recurring patterns of things that they discuss in relation to
Hmm.
this question. And so, yeah, one of them is the age of the writing. Like I said, if it's written too late, that means it can't be written by an apostle, so it's out. So that's one. Church use is also important. They seem to often mention how widely is this book read. Do they know of other people who are using it as well or not? Okay, that often comes up. Is it a book that's sometimes what they would call spoken against? Okay, so this is one that comes up, say, like in Eusebius, where he'll mention books like Second Peter. He says, well, Some people accept it, but some people speak against it. All right. So that tells you that Eusebius is thinking about what other people are saying too. This is not just some Lone Ranger thing that he's deciding. Okay.
Hmm.
But he is often interested in who's writing these things. So the good example, I think, to test this is Mark's gospel. All right. Mark is not by any account an apostle. Okay. But somehow his gospel is accepted into the canon, and I would suggest by the end of the 2nd century, it has a fixed place there with the other Gospels. And it's especially interesting because so much of Mark is in Matthew. So if there was one of the 4 Gospels that you would think, we don't need this one, or we'll reject this one, you might expect it to be Mark, because it's not written by an apostle, and it's mostly in Matthew, right?
Hmm.
And yet what happens is the early church is pretty uniform in saying that Mark's gospel behind it is the preaching of Peter. And that essentially what Mark has done is written down Peter's public preaching, or his preaching of the gospel in Rome. Okay.
Hmm.
And what I find so fascinating is that despite the fact that Mark's gospel is so uniformly associated with Peter and his preaching, you almost never have it called the gospel according to Peter. And the listeners might think, well, who cares? Well, because it shows you, I think, that the early church was trying to preserve the authorship of these gospels, while still they were very interested in whose authority was behind it. Does that make sense? So they could distinguish those two things. They could distinguish who actually wrote it from whose authority was behind it, but both things mattered to them, and they preserved both, even though in the case of Mark's gospel, it's really Peter's authority that matters, you see, but they still consistently refer to it as the gospel according to Mark, even though Mark he's not like some famous character in the New Testament.
Yeah.
You know, if you're gonna make up a name to attach to it, well, first of all, I pick Peter's name because he's way more important than Mark. But even then, even if you're going to pick somebody else, you don't pick Mark of all people. You know, pick James or somebody like that, or Jude, the half brother of Jesus. But Mark is a nobody, really. So I think Mark's gospel is a really interesting test case to help us think through that. What I said is, if they're interested in apostolic authority, that doesn't have to mean an apostle directly wrote it, but it does mean it has an apostle's authority behind it. So same thing with Luke's gospel then. Luke is not viewed as an apostle, but he's viewed as a close associate and a travel companion with Paul. And consistently they will talk about Paul's authority as being sort of attached to Luke's gospel, if I can put it that way.
Yeah. I love that illustration that you used about Mark, because here's someone who abandoned Paul on the missionary journey, caused a rift between him and Barnabas. Not one of these top dogs like Peter. So if you could just slap any name on the book, and the whole point was let's just up the authority of this book by putting any old name on there. Certainly, if you can connect it to Peter, you'll go Peter. But the church was actually trying to be very careful to note who is the real author of this book. And so the church is really being quite honest and open about full disclosure here. Mark wrote this,
That's right.
So, I think on the last time I had you on the show, you said something like, if there's a conspiracy, probably the more exciting sensationalist version is not the truth. It's probably the more boring answer.
It usually is. This is true.
It's probably the more boring. It works in text criticism. It works here too in canon, right?
It's true. It's true.
Well, can you tell us a story about a conversation maybe that you've had where your work in this area helped somebody either reconsider their skepticism about the Bible, somebody outside the church, or maybe actually helped a Christian answer some questions, some doubts that they were having about trusting the Bible?
Sure. I mean, I don't think it was too long ago where a member of our church, she's got a brother who came with exactly this question and said, my brother was telling me about the Bible and why you can't believe it. And he said, I can't remember how exactly I should put it, but something like some guy or Caesar invented the Bible and made the Bible. And I said, oh, like Constantine? And she goes, yeah, I think that was it. Right? And I was like, name. Right. Because it was like, 9 times out of 10, that's somebody's kind of go-to is to say, hey, it was just Constantine, and therefore you can't really trust the Bible. So she was really helped, I think, honestly, even just know that I knew what her brother was talking about, and that she wasn't crazy for passing this info along to me, but also she wasn't crazy for like thinking he was wrong, like I'm pretty sure that's not right, but
Mm-hmm.
I have no idea why.
Yeah.
And so what I find to be the case is on a lot of these questions, many of us just don't know what we don't know. And we mentioned at the start of the conversation that class at Moody Bible Institute that I had on the history of the Bible, and I was one of those students where it was just like, wow, I didn't know any of this. I just had this. If you'd asked me where the Bible came from, I would have said from God. And if you'd said, yeah, but like where and how, I would have been
How?
like, well, I mean, they wrote it and that's it. Like it would have been a very short story. It would have been
Mm-hmm.
God inspired the writers. They wrote it. That's it. Like what else is, maybe somebody translated. Okay. But, but a lot of people are helped to know that there really is, they really can know a lot. Of course, there are things we
Mm-hmm.
would like to know more about, for sure. Historians always want to know more about the past, right? Okay,
Yeah.
we're sort of greedy in that way, if I can put it that way. But we do know quite a lot, actually, and there's certain things we can just rule out. Again, like the theory that sort of Constantine decided the Bible, or the Council of Nicaea voted on it. We can
Mm-hmm.
pretty safely rule these things out. And then again, we have evidence like all these canon lists we can actually look at and walk through. We can read the church fathers and early Christian writers, early, in some cases, non-Christian writers or whatnot. So yeah, I've had any number of encounters like that where people are really
Mm-hmm.
helped. Usually the way it comes is not where people are usually most troubled is where somebody's brought it to their attention.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
I was talking to a guy earlier this week, and he's gotten really into text criticism. And I said, "Well, how'd you get into that?" Because not a lot of people get into that on their own. He said, "Oh, well, I had I think it was a Jehovah's Witness who came and
Mm.
talked to him, and he started saying stuff to him he didn't know anything about, and realized he didn't really know much of anything about how we got the Bible, and so
Mm-hmm.
got really interested in text criticism, and that put him onto Dan Wallace's stuff, and so yeah."
Yeah, well, that's great. So this is very practical as well. It's not just an area for, interested scholars and historians, but really it helps people with doubts that they might have about their own faith.
Mm-hmm.
Helps Christians, and then even those outside the church who maybe have seen these conspiracy stories depicted in movies and popular novels. But again, the more sensationalized version makes a good fictitious story, but it's just very far removed from the actual truth. And they don't just have to take our word for it. They can actually go back to the original source documents, because after all, this was a church council, a meeting. There were a kind of meeting minutes that were taken,
Yep.
so we know what they talked about.
Yep.
Versus, well, I saw it in a Dan Brown novel or in a movie, Da Vinci
Yep.
Code movie, right?
Yep.
So that's another way that this has gotten on the radar for a lot of people. Well, if you're watching this, hit like if you're getting some value from this conversation. And let's turn now to this idea of translations. Of course, the New Testament documents were written in Greek, and we have it in English now. And so there's a whole story, kind of part two of the story, besides canonization of the original books. What now is the story about how we got these in English, so that we have a Bible that we can actually read. Those of us who don't know ancient languages, not every Christian has to study ancient languages. You can read the Bible and be a faithful follower of Jesus, and you have God's word in English. But how did we get the English Bible, the English New Testament that we have today? How would you begin to approach that question?
First thing I would say is people should not take for granted that we have translations. Some religions are not, what should we say, not as enthusiastic as we might be about translating their holy book.
That's right.
Okay, so you might think of something like Islam, where certain Muslims would take a different view toward translating the Quran than we would take to translating the Bible. Or you might think of something like the Book of Mormon, that has no originals to translate from anymore, right? There's no golden tablets that you can retranslate and update it from or go back to. And also, Christians themselves have not always been uniform on this, right? So there has been sometimes antagonism toward the idea of translating the Bible, even from Christians, say during the Reformation, most famously, of course. But if we go all the way back, you can see that early on Christians have a real desire to translate the Bible. So early on we have translations of the Bible into Latin and Syriac and Greek. And those even have precedent in the translation of the Old Testament into Greek before the time of Jesus, what we call the Septuagint. Okay, so there's actually a fairly long history of translating the Bible going way back. But when you think about English, our first complete English Bible is from the 14th century and is probably inspired by John Wycliffe. it's momentous because it is the first complete Bible in English ever. Before that, you'd had maybe individual books in English or sections of the Bible, maybe select prayers, for example, that had been translated into English, or maybe you had like a Latin copy of the Bible where somebody had written English words over the Latin letters. Okay, that's not quite a translation like we would think of. So the Wycliffe Bible is famous for being the first complete English Bible in the 14th century, but it is completed. It's done from Latin, and it is fairly early on. It faces strong resistance from church authority, and is banned. Basically, it's basically outlawed. And so that puts a real damper on English Bible translation for a long time. And it's not until you get to the 16th century with a guy named William Tyndale that you get the first English New Testament that is translated not from Latin, but from the original language of Greek. And so Tyndale's Bible is considered the first, Tyndale's really considered the father of the modern English Bible. The other reason for that is the English language has changed pretty dramatically from the time of Wycliffe to the time of Tyndale. And even though Tyndale's Bible is still going to be hard to read in places and some of the vocabulary is going to be different, most of us today could still read it and get and understand it. Whereas if I gave you a copy of the Wycliffe Bible, even if I updated the spelling, you're going to have a lot harder time with it because it's just a much more older English.
Yeah. And the spelling's kind of fluid in some of these Bibles too. Like on the same page, they'll be spelled different ways because it just wasn't as standardized as we have it today.
There's no standardized spelling. Yeah, we take for granted that spelling is standardized, but that's much more of a modern, recent phenomenon.
Yeah.
So you want to think of Wycliffe as your first complete Bible, and then Tyndale as your first English New Testament that's from Greek. Tyndale also starts work on the Old Testament. He gets as far as about Chronicles in the Old Testament, but he, as listeners may know, is martyred. Not just for his translation, I should say. Sometimes people think it's just for the translation. It's really not. It's just as much for his theology, which he was very much a disciple of Luther's theology by this point, and had written a number of books defending Luther's theology, or at least explaining it and giving it to English readers. Just one indication of Luther's influence on Tyndale. Tyndale follows the Luther Bible in its order of books for the New Testament. Okay, and when it comes to the book of Romans, Tyndale translates Luther's preface to the Romans into English. All he really does is add a couple paragraphs of his own at the end. But that preface to Romans is longer than the book of Romans itself.
Wow.
And if you want to fast forward just a little ways, a few centuries, it is reading that preface to Romans by Martin Luther where John Wesley, another very famous figure in the history of the church, John Wesley, that's how he gets saved, actually. His story of his own conversion is going to this Bible study, and they're reading Luther's preface to Romans. So it gives you some sense of just how powerful that preface is. But I also like to say it's a reminder to us that these early Bible translators knew that they needed to help the reader because they knew their Bible readers had never sat down with the Bible and read all the way through something like Romans, right? At best, they'd maybe heard it in church or they'd seen it in pictures. But most people had never sat down with a copy of the Bible in their lap and been able to read all the way through Romans, right? So these early translators knew that their readers needed some help. So a lot of these early Bibles have things like notes in the margin. They may have an introduction to the whole Bible that helps you think about how to read it, how to put it all together. They've got prefaces. Sometimes they have maps and pictures, lots of things to help the reader.
Now, you also mentioned earlier in the show about the versification, chapters and verses. How does that fit into where we are in the story now?
Yeah, it's good. So most people point to a guy named Stephen Langton in the 13th century as the origin of our modern chapter divisions. But actually, chapter divisions go well back before that.
Sure. Yes.
Our first copy of the New Testament with chapter divisions, they don't match ours, but their chapter divisions is in like the 4th century. Okay, so and if you think about that's interesting. Some people suspect that the origin of that goes back to the Psalms. Because if you think the Psalms it may well be the first part of the Bible that gets numbered. Once you have a first, second, and third Psalm, and on you go, you start to think maybe we could kind of do this to other parts of the Bible too.
Yeah.
But anyways, our modern chapters are usually said to go back to the 13th century. Our verse numbers, it depends on the Testament. For the Old Testament, they ultimately go back to the Hebrew Masoretic scribes. They had various divisions they used in the Hebrew text that then got adopted into English with some adjustments in certain places. They don't always match up. In the New Testament, we can actually point to one particular individual, a guy named Robert Stephanus, who in 1551 produced an edition of a Greek and Latin New Testament, and they had verses. And what he meant by verses was essentially what we mean when we're talking about poetry. We talk about a verse of poetry. He just meant a line of text.
Mm-hmm.
And he divided the text into these verses so that he could keep his Greek and Latin text in parallel columns, neat and tidy all the way through. And then he says it also makes it easier to cross-reference them. So it makes it a lot easier to say something like, it makes it a lot easier to say, like in the Gospels, if you want to refer to parallel passages, if you can do it by chapter and verse, right?
That's right.
But it's a helpful reminder to us that actually the verses in the New Testament, in my opinion, are not quite as good as they are in the Old Testament. Because in the Old Testament, they are the product of these Masoretic scribes who knew the text really, really well, and just were very conscientious in the way they did things. Whereas in the New Testament, it's really the product of just one guy. So, there are places where any modern scholar or Bible translator complains about the verse divisions because they're not ideal. But they do require decisions. They require you to decide where's a break in the thought, if you want to think of it that way, and people can disagree on that. So it's helpful to remember those verse divisions are not inspired and they don't go back to the original authors.
Wasn't there a little, perhaps an urban legend about this guy on carriage, in a carriage on horseback or something, and whenever the road had a bump in it, he would put a verse.
Yeah.
But probably he was just traveling, more like working in a hotel or something.
Robert Stephanus' son tells us that this is how his dad did it. And there's this Latin phrase where it seems to suggest he did it while on horseback. And some have read that as meaning he was literally on the horse's back, and every time the horse bounced, he put a new verse in. Probably, other people think now that probably means while he was traveling. And he must have done this, on the stops along the way. But it's fun to think about.
So many people don't know that we actually had English Bibles before the King James Version, obviously the most famous, the great granddaddy, the godfather of what we think of as our modern English translations. But you've just brought up some of these earlier translations now, so including the Geneva Bible and things like that beforehand. Why isn't the King James Bible, even if it's been revised for modern readers, it's not the 1611 version. Why is the King James Bible no longer the go-to that it was kind of in the 1960s, even in America?
Yeah, that's a great question. Well, first thing to say is, it stands out in history for being the go-to for so long. And part of the reason for that is, frankly, because the king put an embargo on other Bible translations. So, I always joke that if President of the United States suddenly said you could only buy one book on the history of the Bible and it was mine would probably sell pretty well, as you know. So I don't mean to take anything away from the King James Bible, but I think it is important to remember that it had some help to become so famous. But, for 250 years, it was the unchallenged champion. It was the only the only Bible for the English-speaking world, and served people really well for a long time. A couple things happened, though, in those 250 years. One is that scholars discovered or began to study in more detail more manuscripts of the Bible, and in particular of the New Testament. Okay, so this is well before the Dead Sea Scrolls or anything like that. But for the New Testament, we had some really important and older manuscripts that were discovered and then began to be studied and digested by scholars. And so scholars became convinced that the text that King James was based on, at least in the New Testament, was inferior to what was in some of these older manuscripts. So that was one reason. Then the other reason, of course, the English language changes. So, even at the time in 1611, the King James already has some language in it that may have been archaic at the time, or at least may not have been commonly spoken. It may have been familiar to people in reading and in formal written language, but maybe not in spoken English at the time. So English has changed in the meantime, and so kind of at least the two big factors are the changes in the English language, and then more manuscripts that scholars know about. And I should also add to that, there are places where scholars just came to the conclusion that the King James translators were wrong in their interpretation of the Greek or Hebrew behind it, right? So it's not as if study of the Greek and Hebrew text behind the King James stopped in 1611. It certainly didn't. Scholars continued to study Greek and Hebrew And there's and even in 1611 there are places where the translators themselves said this word could mean this or that, right? So they acknowledge within their own margins the fact that there are differing interpretations of some of their decisions. So those things kind of boiled. They're boiling. It's not like nobody ever criticized the King James. There were criticisms of it right away, and those just sort of boiled up to the surface. Finally, by 1881, we get the first official revision of the King James Bible.
Yeah, and there are a number of things in there that were carried over from Latin, some different variants. And so not only did we have more manuscripts, it's not just more, it's thousands more than they had in 1611, right?
Yeah, and you mentioned Latin terms. My favorite one is unicorn. You'll find unicorns in the King James Bible in a few places. Now, at least in the book of Job, there was a marginal note in the original King James explaining they meant rhinoceros by this, because unicorn is just Latin for one-horned animal. But even that's a good example where you won't find rhinoceros in any English Bible today, because most Hebrew dictionaries will say that the term means it is a different kind of animal. It's not a rhinoceros. That it may have been a horned animal, but not a rhinoceros. So, things like, some of the most difficult things for translators to handle are names for animals. Okay, so you think of the book of Leviticus where you have a list of all these animals. Okay, those are tricky. Plants is another one that's like that. Okay. Cultural terms, things like Leviathan or kinsman redeemer, these are cultural terms that are really tricky. And then a fourth one I'll just mention, there are others besides these, of course, but a fourth one that's difficult for translators to wrestle with is terms for monetary units, money. Okay.
Yeah.
How do you handle that? We have places like in the Gospels where Mark uses a Greek term for a monetary unit and then explains it with a Latin term. So neither of those are monetary units that we use today, and our monetary units are different in the US from what they are in the UK, from what they are in South Africa to what they are in New Zealand and Australia, but they are certainly different from what was used in 1611 Elizabethan England, right?
Yeah.
Right? So these are terms that translators have to deal with, and they often want to update them. People sometimes are disturbed that translations get updated, but actually when you study the history of translation, one of the things you discover right away is that translations have always been revised, always. Going all the way back to the Septuagint. We have at least 3 known revisions of the Septuagint where particular names were attached to them of an individual who was responsible for them. Same thing we get in Latin. We have the old Latin translation that Jerome revises into the Vulgate. In Syriac, we have at least 4 revisions of 4 different versions of the Syriac. And you can show the same thing in other languages like Coptic. The Wycliffe Bible, the very first complete English Bible, okay? Some scholars suggest there are two main editions of it, an earlier and a later one. They're within a decade of each other. But some scholars think that the second one was started before the first one was even done. They're already revising it before they finish the first one, right? Tyndale revises his own New Testament. And I think the reason for this is very simple. The Bible is a big book, and anyone who undertakes the massive effort of translating it, by the time they make very much progress on it, their language skills have improved, and they've probably changed their mind on some things. Right? Tyndale probably got through the Pentateuch, right? First 5 books of the Old Testament. And by the end of that already is thinking, I can do better in Genesis, right? I want to go back. Because you just get better at it. Any language student knows the more you work at a language, the better you get, right? Your understanding gets better. So I think it's just the case that translators themselves tend to be unhappy with their own work and think we can do better, right? So in some ways, I think the King James Bible is actually the anomaly in English Bible history. It's the anomaly in that it took so long for it to be revised. The King James itself, of course, is a revision of a Bible that came out just within a decade of itself, the Bishop's Bible of 1602. So again, the history of the Bible really is a history of revision after revision after revision after revision, because translators want to improve their own work.
So another question that often gets asked is, okay, so there's all these different translations now. We don't just have the King James. Like when the boomers were in college, 1984, NIV came out and people were going, what on earth is going on? We can't just all stand up and recite the same Bible verse. Now there's all these different translations.
Yeah.
Well, different translations have different philosophies for why things are translated more literally or more dynamic equivalent, as we say. And so with this whole swath of Bibles to choose from, people wonder, what is the best translation to read?
Yeah.
How do you approach a massive question like that if someone just asks you, what's the best translation? Because I'm just about to buy one right here. What do you suggest?
Okay, so there's some questions I like to ask a person if they're asking that question. One I might ask is, what's the translation you already use? And is there a reason why you're unhappy with it? I think that might be a good question. I might ask a question like, hopefully you're attending church. What translation does your church use? And is there a reason why you want to use a different one? Let's see, what else? The person's age comes into play. If it's a 12-year-old or an 8-year-old, that might be a different answer than a 30-year-old. Another question is, how long have you been a Christian? If you're a brand new Christian, I tend to recommend a different translation. If you're brand new to the Christian faith, you've never read the Bible. Okay, so my basic advice that I give people usually is, I recommend a translation that is on the literal end of the spectrum. Pick the one that is the most literal that you still find understandable. Okay, so when you think of the spectrum, you're thinking, way the furthest end of the spectrum away from literal will be a paraphrase. So that's where a translator is not necessarily trying to translate the Greek and Hebrew. They may even start with another English translation and then paraphrase that. Okay, or they are just really trying to. They do not feel bound very much to the original at all. So something like The Message is like this, right? That paraphrase is not trying to represent what's in the Greek and Hebrew in most cases. It's doing something different. It's not doing something bad, in my opinion, but it's doing something very different. Then further on the spectrum, you have something like the New Living Translation, which I would not consider a paraphrase. I would consider it a true translation, but it's more paraphrastic. They're erring on the side of understandability. Okay. Then on the far end of something that's very literal, you think of something like the NASB, which in certain places they're trying to follow the word order if they can. They may be trying to represent every word. They're going so far as when they have a word in English that there's no single equivalent for in the original, they'll put it in italics, which some readers think is like for emphasis, but it's not. It's actually showing you that word is not in the original. There's no equivalent for it in the original. Okay. Now, when it comes to translation, all translators have to do interpretation. So it's not a question, do you want a translation that interprets the original language or one that doesn't? It's a question of how much interpretation do you want the translators to do for you. So something like the New Living Translation is doing more interpretation for you as the reader than something like the NASB. Okay, there are phrases in the original that could be read one way or the other, and if the NASB can avoid reading it one way or the other, they often will. It often will, right? So they'll leave the ambiguity there for the English reader if they can. The NLT will rarely do that, right? So it's a question of how much interpretation do you want done for you. Now, again, if you're a brand new Christian and you've never read the Bible, it's actually super helpful to have somebody help you with interpretation, right? But that's why I say try to use the one that's most literal that you can still understand. Because if you can't understand it, it doesn't do you any good, right? And that's why I would steer most modern readers away from the King James, at least as their primary translation, because many of us will read the King James and there will be places where we do not know that we are misreading it. We won't even know that the English language has changed. And so we may actually derive the opposite meaning that they meant in 1611. It's not our fault and it's not their fault. It's just that we don't know, right?
Yeah.
So that's my basic advice. Now, one more thing I'll say about this question, okay? There's a lot to say on this, and I get asked it a lot, so I have a lot to say now after having been asked it many, many times. Okay, people need to know that there are mainstream, and here I'll qualify a little bit, are mainstream evangelical translations. Okay, something like ESV, NASB, NIV. I don't happily include the NLT here. They are all really, really good. Okay, and listeners should know that when they choose a mainstream Bible translation today, they are not choosing between a good translation and a bad one. Okay, there are bad translations out there. I will not deny that. Something like the Passion Translation, if listeners have heard of that, is genuinely a bad translation. Okay, I'm not talking about those. I'm talking about mainstream Bible translations. They're a choice instead between good and good. Right? Now, the problem is sometimes this can paralyze people because the more choices you have, the more nervous you get about making the wrong choice.
Mm-hmm.
Right?
True.
And what can happen then as a result, when we feel this sort of pressure about making a choice that we feel nervous about, we actually can end up exaggerating the differences between the choices in an effort to make our decision easier. So that's, I think, actually why some people actually are kind of find comfort in thinking that it's a choice between good and bad translations, right?
Mm-hmm.
If they can think, well, the most literal translation is the best and all the other ones are bad, oh man, it relieves me of that anxiety, doesn't it? It makes me feel a lot better about choosing this one, and I know I've rejected the bad ones. But actually, if it's a choice between good and good, then we feel kind of anxious, like, well, what then makes them different, right? And there are differences between them, and we go into this in the book, of course, because there
Mm-hmm.
are real differences between them. But again, I just want to actually kind of relieve our listeners and say, you shouldn't feel that anxiety. Any of the mainstream English translations is going to serve you really, really well. Now,
Right.
if you're a Bible teacher and you don't know Greek and Hebrew, you should probably be consulting multiple translations in your preparation. That would be my strong recommendation to you. We have multiple translations. What a blessing it is to have them.
Mm-hmm.
And sometimes they reflect different interpretations. And that's a really good thing to know. They may alert you to places where you need to do more work, right? And inevitably, as a Bible teacher, you get asked by students, but my Bible says, or why does my Bible say? And it can be great to have some understanding and have done a bit of work on your own beforehand to have an answer to that. But that's my basic answer, is pick the most literal translation that you still find understandable, and then don't feel too anxious about picking the wrong translation. As long as you're
Mm-hmm.
picking one of these mainstream translations, you're going to have a very good translation. And then the last thing to say is flip the question. What's the worst translation? Well, some of you have heard the answer, but the answer is simple. It's the one you don't read, right?
Mm-hmm.
You got to read the Bible for it to benefit you. So who
Yeah.
cares if you have the best translation in the world ever made, but it's on your shelf somewhere not being read? On the other hand, a mediocre translation that's well read is better than the best translation that's never read, right? So keep that in mind.
Lots of good ideas there. I like how you said it's not a question between good and bad. If you're looking at these mainstream translations, it's good and good. So you might say, would it sound better if I played a G chord on a Gibson Les Paul or on a Fender Strat? Well, maybe a different tool for a different kind of music or something, but they're both good guitars, right? Also loved how you talked about the options paralysis. Maybe somebody, they just want the thing to do more interpretation for them. It's like, which is the best camera in the world? Well, you can buy a camera which looks great and fully auto. You can use your phone and everything's automatic, or you can mess with all the f-stops and change the lenses out. But then if you've never used a camera before, you're going to be like, I don't even know how to start with this
is
thing.
the way to go.
That's right. So with Bible translations, I love how you mentioned that. It's first of all, what are you doing with it, right? Are you even reading it first? So they say the best camera is the one that you actually have with you, right? The best Bible is the one that you can read and help you draw closer to the Lord, versus one that you think is the best, but it's just something that you're not even going to read. And also, it's not like people didn't have the gospel in 1611 when all they had was the King James Bible.
Right.
You're not going to miss the gospel because you accidentally chose the Net Bible versus the LEB versus, right?
That's right. The King James Bible is a fantastic translation. It's served English Bible readers so well for a long time. The fact that I think we can do better today does not mean I need to disparage that translation at all.
It was the very best scholarship we had in 1611.
It was fantastic.
It's just we have way more manuscripts now to help us get back to the original text. Well, we've covered a lot of material here today. Is there anything else you want to add before we land the plane on our show today?
Just let people know that if they want to learn more, of course, there's the book that we wrote, but also we write monthly. We publish monthly articles on our website, textandcanon.org. That's CANON, not the Civil War battlefield instrument. But textandcanon.org, it's an institute I co-direct here at Phoenix Seminary, and we try to publish accessible articles for people on the whole gamut of how we got the Bible. Everything from canon that we've talked about today to translations to the Old Testament text, and kind of everything in between. So I encourage listeners to go there and explore more and learn about the fascinating history of how we got this incredible book that we love.
Well, thank you so much first of all, for writing the book, Scribes in Scripture. I appreciate it as a teacher, a professor at Moody using your book now in Bible Intro. So how cool is that?
It's great.
So thanks for writing that book, and thanks for being on the show today.
Happy to. Thanks for having me.
And we thank you so much for joining us here on the Apologetics Guys show today. If you enjoyed this conversation, please do leave a review for us on Apple Podcasts or Spotify, and rate us on Spotify. If you're watching the YouTube video, please leave a comment down below so that we know that you're enjoying these conversations. It really does help more people hear about what we're doing on the show and helps get the word out about the show to others. So thanks again for joining us. I'm Dr. Mikel Del Rosario, and until next time, keep the faith.